California in the late 1960s held an almost mythical fascination for young people across the United States. It was the land of sunshine and opportunity, where dreams of freedom, creativity, and reinvention were said to bloom as vibrantly as its golden poppies. In the years between 1967 and 1969, California, particularly Los Angeles and San Francisco, became a beacon for seekers of all kinds: artists, musicians, hippies, and anyone disillusioned with the conventional path laid out by their parents. The Summer of Love in 1967 had cemented California as the epicenter of a youth movement steeped in ideas of peace, love, and communal living. For those growing up in the conservative heartland or industrial towns of the Iron Belt, the West Coast symbolized escape. It was a place where they could break free from societal norms, experiment with alternative lifestyles, and carve out a life that felt authentic and unbound by the expectations of the past. But as the decade progressed, the sunny idealism that drew so many to California began to cast its shadows. While the promise of freedom attracted thousands, it also created fertile ground for predators, con men, and charlatans to exploit the vulnerable. Among those who flocked to California were young people searching for community and belonging, often at their most emotionally fragile. For some, that search led them to Spahn Ranch, an old movie set in the hills outside Los Angeles that became home to Charles Manson and his so-called family. To the impressionable, Spahn Ranch might have seemed like a dream come true, a sanctuary of countercultural ideals where they could live off the land, make music, and reject the constraints of modern society. But the reality was darker. Manson, a manipulative and charismatic figure, weaponized the vulnerabilities of those who joined him, turning their ideals against them. What began as a quest for love and freedom became a nightmare of control, violence, and ultimately infamy. In this video, we examine what California represented to the young people who ended up at Spahn Ranch, and how the Manson family became emblematic of the darker side of the California dream. Through the stories of 4 individuals, including Linda Kasabian, who would later play a pivotal role in the family's downfall, we explore how the golden promise of the West Coast was tarnished by disillusionment, exploitation, and horror. In the summer of 1968, a young woman traveling by RV down to Mexico picked up Susan Atkins, Paul Watkins, and one other man hitchhiking. They asked for a ride to Spahn Ranch. The woman was Joan Marilyn Wildebush, born January 21, 1944, the daughter of an economist. Joan was born in San Francisco but grew up in New Jersey with the best education a young woman could achieve during that era. That summer, Joan was on summer break from a teaching job and heading south of the border to meet her fiancé. She had also recently come into an inheritance after her father's death the year before. She asked the 3 young people to call her Juanita, an affinity with the Latin lifestyle, as she drove them to Chatsworth. When they arrived, they were greeted by Charles Manson. He came over and put his arms around me and said how glad he was. Charlie got a guitar out and everybody started singing. It was just wonderful fun, but it was very clear that nobody had any talent. Charlie asked if he could spend the night with me, and I told him no. He let me know that I was being selfish. Nonetheless, Juanita stayed. The wooing began almost immediately. Somebody came along and brought me breakfast. Then Charlie brought me coffee. From dawn on, I had somebody around to tell me how wonderful it was there, and I don't think I ever spent another 5 minutes alone. Eventually, Juanita, who Squeaky endearingly described as a dumpling blonde the likes of Mae West, did have sex with Manson despite her earlier protestations. They dropped acid, crawled into her camper, and made love. Within days, Juanita gave Charlie what he was really looking for. I'd signed over my camper and a $16,000 trust fund. George was in danger of losing the ranch to back taxes. I signed over the money to Charlie, and we paid 6 years' worth of taxes on it. Weeks later, the family all took a large quantity of acid together with disastrous effects. Sandra Good started screaming, everyone was having very dark visions, and Paul actually hit Juanita. Weeks later, everyone moved out to Death Valley, where things briefly lightened up, but soon morale began to plummet. Joan remembered how Manson started talking about Hitler. The world needed a big purging every once in a while, and I remember saying, if Hitler were here now, I'd be dead. He just laughed and said, no, you missed the point. It's got nothing to do with whether or not you've got Jewish blood. It has to do with purging the world and having only people who can survive. The only thing that was wrong with those people is that they weren't smart enough to figure out how to escape it. Manson also began to test people's loyalty and endurance. I pretty well did whatever he told me to do, Juanita admitted. For me to walk 40 miles? I had blisters on the soles of my feet that were 2.5 inches in diameter because Charlie wanted me to go somewhere, and I didn't have a car, so I walked. By November, most of the family had returned to the Los Angeles area. At the start of 1969, Charlie had Juanita stay at Spahn Ranch to keep an eye on George Spahn. By March, George had agreed to let the family return to the ranch full-time. However, Juanita and Brooks Poston were sent back to Death Valley, told that someone would come and relieve them, but it was months before anyone showed up. In the meantime, at Barker Ranch, Juanita and Brooks met someone else, prospector Paul Crockett and his business partner Bob Berry. After trying to talk to Wilderbush and Poston, Crockett realized that they were under some kind of mind control. We didn't know how to think for ourselves or make decisions for ourselves at all. We came out and told them that the place was taken. But Brooks and Juanita had little in the way of provisions, which melted their standoffishness. Paul and Bob were gold and mineral prospectors, but Crockett was also familiar with cults. Paul essentially deprogrammed Brooks and me, Juanita said. He talked about the way Charlie got control over everybody by getting people to agree that he was something spectacular and agree to his other self-serving ideas. He said that agreements are much more powerful than people realize they are, and that implied agreements are more powerful than overt agreements. It was those implied agreements that were making it very difficult for us to break away from him. Paul, Brooks, and I used to stay up until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning just talking. Back at Spahn's, Manson's increased talk of violence was beginning to unnerve some of his family. In June, he told Paul that black people could only do what white people told them. Maybe, he said, we should teach them how to start a race war. A few days later, unsettled, Paul Watkins left for Barker Ranch with Barbara Bo Rosenberg. When Watkins and Rosenberg arrived in Death Valley, they discovered that Brooks and Juanita had defected and were living with Paul Crockett and Bob Berry. It was very clear to them that we were alive again, Juanita explained. They had been sent up to get us and to bring us home, and we told them we weren't going. And they stayed for several days, ostensibly to talk us into going. But it was very, very clear that they really wanted to find out what had happened. And Bo in particular just kept saying, you're really staying here, and you're happy? And I kept saying, yeah, I am. Within days, Crockett also began deprogramming Bo and Paul. Juanita said Crockett gave them just enough to make them interested in breaking away. But Paul Watkins said, no, I've got to go back and see Charlie. We asked him to wait until the whole family was together. and to say that we wanted Charlie to release us from any agreements we had made with him, and that we in turn would release him from any agreements he had made with us. We asked him to do it in front of everybody because Charlie couldn't turn down requests in front of everybody. Paul and Bo did return to Spahn Ranch, where Watkins tested Brooks and Juanita's assignment. Manson said, of course, they're released. Nobody has any agreements to me. He said, I don't have any holds on anybody. And so Watkins said, well, then do you release me from any agreements with you? And Charlie said, of course. And Barbara said, and me? And Charlie said, yeah. And Paul looked around the room at the rest of the family members and said, and what about them? And Charlie said, enough of this shit about agreements, and wouldn't release anybody else. Watkins left the ranch and returned to Death Valley, where he stayed with Crockett, Barry, Wildebush, and Poston. When the murders occurred in August 1969, Joan had just married Bob Barry and was on her honeymoon in Vegas. They did not go back to Death Valley, but the Manson family soon returned there, where Paul Watkins learned of their crimes. Weeks later, the family was arrested and formally charged with the murders. Bob and Joan later moved to the Pacific Northwest, where she became a healthcare professional. She obtained her Master of Medical Social Work in 1981 and spent 4 decades as a hospice social worker and licensed psychotherapist, specializing in addiction recovery. We believe that the Barrys did have children together. Bob has since passed away. Joan is still alive. On August 16, 1969, just days after the Tate LaBianca murders, the then largest law enforcement raid occurred in California history at none other than Spahn Ranch. It was the culmination of a months-long investigation into reports of auto theft by members of the Manson family and was led by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office with support from multiple other state agencies. By July 1969, a month before the raid, police knew that the potential culprits were a group of hippies living at Spahn's who were not only involved in auto theft, but in drug use and dealing, credit card fraud and theft, sex trafficking, and harboring teenage runaways. But the inciting incident that began the investigation was started by this gal. Her name is Patricia Joan Baldwin. She was born May 27, 1946, in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, north of Pittsburgh. Patty, as she was known, had been a social butterfly as a teen and young adult. She was one of 6 children, and she is splashed all over her high school yearbook, including photos in drama club, French club, and this telling goal from her senior year. Well, she got that chance. Although she was enrolled in college after graduation, within a year or 2 she split for California. No idea if she did ever work as a hat check girl, however. Lynette Frome wrote that Patty was a tough East Coast girl with cropped dark hair and what someone described as a cookie dough complexion. Once Frome wrote, as we were about to pass in the hallway, she approached me with that smile and spoke to me with that voice, and before I understood her intention, she pressed herself into me, tenderly kissing my mouth. Squeaky pleasantly but firmly declined little Patty's advances. We do not know how Patty got to California, how or when she met the family, but on April 9th, Dale Butler of Butler's Buggy Shop in Chatsworth purchased a used Volkswagen Beetle from her. He later realized that the VW had been stolen from his own storage yard and called police to file a complaint. Baldwin listed the Gresham Street address, aka the Yellow Submarine, a 2-story house in Canoga Park where the family was staying that spring, on her paperwork with the buggy shop. It was this report from Dale's shop that later became the infamous August 16th raid. Little Patty, sometimes called Crazy Patty, was often assigned to the duties of watching the children. By July 1969, after the shooting of Bernard Crowe, Manson was unstable, a man on the edge. He had the children moved to a new camp by the waterfall with Leslie, Katie, and little Patty. After the murders, the raid, and the slaying of Spahn Ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea, the family retreated to Death Valley. A month later, it too was raided, and the family all arrested, including little Patty. This time, Patricia gave the name Linda Lou Baldwin at arrest. It just so happened to be her younger sister's name. On November 5th, several family members were staying at a house in Venice Beach, rented by Mark Ross, a character actor who went by the moniker Aesop Aquarian. Those in Venice included Cappy, Bruce, Country Sue, Little Patty, Cowboy Bill, and Zero, true name John Haught. Little Patty and Zero, who might have been boyfriend-girlfriend at the time, were staying in what was known as the Shy Room. The other bedrooms had their doors off. Allegedly, Zero picked up a .22 revolver, spun to play Russian roulette, and shot himself in the head. Russian roulette is normally played with just one bullet in the chamber, giving the odds of 5 to 1 of survival. When police arrived, they found that every chamber in the revolver had been loaded, and the gun subsequently wiped clean, but traces of Bruce Davis's prints were later found on it. Police ruled it an accident and declined to press charges against any of the witnesses. A reminder that months before, Zero had been part of Bill Van Sickle's group, running around the valley robbing and stealing. Van Sickle was among those present at the time of Zero's unaliving. Sometime in 1970, Patty left California with Bill Van Sickle and his girlfriend Claudia Lee Smith, a late joinee to the family. They made their way to Kansas City and then to a farm property that Bill rented northeast of KC, not far, in fact, from where he had grown up. The trio began plotting out acreage to grow organic vegetables and even hosted several groups of volunteers to help with the crops. Bill had also formed a ministry called Youth for Life, and the three were living at Nubian Farms with Claudia's new baby girl and a young college student from Ventura County. But in August 1971, Patty had some kind of emotional breakdown at the farm and set fire to one of the buildings, burning it down. Bill called her folks back in Pennsylvania, who came out and took their daughter to a health facility in Memphis. From there, she eventually returned to the Pittsburgh area. In the mid-1970s, Patty married an older divorcee with teenage children. They had one daughter together before they split up. He has since passed away. Patty, still using her married name today, is now a grandmother, and we hear she's doing well. In the spring of 1969, while on the Sunset Strip, Manson family members Ella Jo Bailey and Susan Atkins met an amiable young Texan named Charles Pierce. Charles was living on the beach, and in his car, a silver 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner that he bought just before leaving for Los Angeles. Pierce wound up driving the gals to Spahn Ranch that day and staying, in fact, giving up everything he had, money, driver's license, and that Roadrunner, although by the time it passed into the family's hands, the Plymouth was already in default on its first month's payments to the bank. Charlie, Ella, and Brenda, Nancy Pittman, took the Roadrunner out joyriding one night, winding up with a speeding ticket. After that, Charlie gave the Plymouth to Spahn Ranch hand Randy Starr. Charles Pierce, born May 27, 1949, in Clarksville, Texas, had grown up in Midland. He was the youngest of 5 children and would later discover that Ted Pierce, the man who raised him, an abusive drunk who worked as a night janitor, was not his biological father. His mother, Joyce, had turned to prostitution and conceived her youngest with one of her clients. In late 1968, Charles, newly graduated from high school, took off for the West Coast with 3 buddies. We aren't sure why he wound up with the nickname Sunshine. Perhaps it was a reference to liquid sunshine or LSD. But he arrived at Spahn's happy to see all the girls and the land and basically the sex and drugs. Many years later, he attempted to write a memoir about his life with the family, and while he didn't get far in his writing, he had both good memories and bad. The bad memories included the time that the family all got a dose of stomach virus and had to share one rather unfortunate public outhouse on the property. Sunshine Pierce spoke to author Ed Saunders, one of the first to get an insider's take on the family during the 1970 and 71 trials. He told Saunders that one of Manson's dune buggy fantasies was to kidnap schoolgirls after they got off their school bus in rural areas. They would scout out the area to see where the girls got off the bus, and then snatch them up and take them to the desert hideaway. In early June, Charlie was very excited. On the 3rd of that month, talent scout Greg Jacobson and Columbia Records producer Terry Melcher arrived at Spahn Ranch. They were there to talk to Charlie about a possible television special they'd already pitched to NBC Studios. It was a documentary about the family and their communal life out in Chatsworth. The whole family had worked hard to impress Jacobson and Melcher, making them feel real welcome that day. But then an argument broke out between Melcher, Manson, and Jacobson. Ed Saunders claimed that the argument was witnessed by Sunshine Pierce and was over the direction the film would take. Already they'd shot pictures and made tapes for a presentation. The NBC officials, on the one hand, wanted a verite hippie commune movie with a narrator. But Charlie hated hippies. Charlie wanted to make an honest movie presenting the family in an as-is situation, adding marauder elements, bikers, creepy crawly capers, in order to magnet in on potential followers and attract them. When Melcher left the ranch that day, he placed a call to an associate, a session musician named Mike Deasy. Deasy, who had worked with the Beach Boys and appeared in the famed 1968 Elvis comeback TV special, also owned a mobile recording studio. Terry thought that Manson, who notoriously got nervous in traditional studio sessions, might do well with an outdoor recording jam. So Melcher and Deasy came to the ranch. Melcher didn't stay long. He witnessed an altercation between Charlie and Randy Starr. Starr was drunk, and Charlie had hit the stuntman. Melcher also looked around at the half-starved young people, desperately waiting for Manson's big chance, and out of pity, gave Charlie $50 to buy everyone some food. Charlie somehow took the gesture as a promissory note, believing Terry was giving him money ahead of a future contract. But that was not to be the case. Meanwhile, the girls gave Mike Deasy so much acid that he tripped his balls off for a couple days and fled the ranch in terror. No recordings were completed to our knowledge. A few days after Deasy's disastrous visit, Melcher called Charlie and told him that he wasn't the best guy to arrange his recordings. Some reports show that Charlie was enraged by this rejection. Manson was livid. He approached Sunshine Pierce and asked if he would be interested in a piece of work. Pierce thought it might be robbery and said yes. But what Manson had in mind was murder. He told Pierce that there was one person in particular that he wanted killed, although it might be necessary to kill others as well. He thought he could come up with about $5,000 if Pierce was interested. Pierce was not, and left Spahn Ranch the following day. It seems obvious that Manson had decided to kill either Terry Melcher or Greg Jacobson, or both men. Charles Sunshine Pierce wound up back in Texas, where he married and had children and then joined the Army. He served in Vietnam as a tank commander, rising to the rank of sergeant. Back in Texas, however, his wife had gone off the deep end and was neglecting their kids, who wound up with one of Charles' sisters. Charles returned home, got divorced, and worked as a long-haul truck driver for many years. He remarried in 1980, had one more child, a daughter, and pursued his interest in music. He played guitar and was in several bands throughout his life. He also developed an addiction to heroin. His younger daughter knew for most of her life about her father's involvement with Manson and the family. When asked, Charles told her that Manson was one of the most brilliant people that he had ever met, very charismatic, and could really get into your head. She asked him once if he would be afraid to be in a room alone with Charles Manson, and he said no, that by himself, Charlie was no danger to anyone, but it was his ability to get other people to do things for him that was so dangerous. Charles Pierce continued to battle problems related to his addiction and possibly associated with PTSD, either from his war experiences, his time at Spahn Ranch, or both. In 1997, the Pierce family was living in Kermit, Texas, on the far southwestern corner of the Panhandle. Their home was destroyed in a fire that year, and they moved to Tyler in East Texas. With the insurance money, Charles started his own business in construction and insulation. But before he could really get it off the ground, he was diagnosed with hepatitis C and ended up in the hospital. That July, he nearly died from heart congestion and wound up on disability, forcing him to sell everything he owned for pennies on the dollar. He lost his new business and their new home and automobiles. He was able to secure a position on the transplant list at a Dallas area hospital, but the years passed waiting for a new heart. Charles Pierce ran out of time. In September 2002, he developed MRSA while in the hospital for an infection in his hand from shooting Dilaudid. For the next couple months, he was in and out of treatment, and then he went into a coma. On January 12, 2003, his family made the decision to take him off life support. He was only 51 years old. Charles Sunshine Pierce is remembered fondly as a great musician, a storyteller, a free thinker, and someone willing to fight for what mattered most. His daughter, whom I spoke to in early 2024, was especially bitter that her dad did not live to receive the cure for hepatitis. You can hear my interview with her, as well as the story that Sunshine wrote about his time with the Manson family in my video, The Ranch. The experiences of Linda Kasabian have been covered exhaustively by writers, Manson researchers, and documentarians, including the 6 weeks she spent with the family and her 18 days of testimony during the 1970 Tate LaBianca murder trials. I have also covered Linda's part of the story in my book and in the free audio version available here, so I will keep the preamble short. Born Linda Darlene Druin on June 21, 1949, in Biddeford, Maine, she grew up in New Hampshire where she was a tomboy interested in athletics, and then a young hippie who married young and got involved with drugs. It was her second marriage, still in her teens, to Robert Bob Kasabian that earned her that name, produced her daughter Tanya, and transported her clear across the country to California in 1969. Bob, Linda, and Tanya were staying with a friend in Topanga, Charles Melton, a Dharma bum, and planning a trip to South America along with Melton and another couple. But Linda was dissatisfied with her marriage, and on one fateful day in June 1969, she met Catherine Gypsy Scher, who invited her to come to Spahn Ranch. Linda took Tanya and left with Gypsy that day. Over the next 6 weeks, Linda immersed herself in the lifestyle and philosophies of Charles Manson and the family. She participated in orgies, took LSD in group trips, sent 18-month-old Tanya off with the other children, stole $5,000 from Charles Melton, at Tex Watson's suggestion, and donated it to the family, and participated in the creepy crawls. She also fell in love with Charles Manson. According to her testimony, she was selected by Manson, along with Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel, to join Tex Watson for a late-night drive on August the 9th, which resulted in the 5 murders at Cielo Drive. Linda did not kill anyone. However, she did witness some of the killing, even lending a knife to 1 or 2 of the killers. She debated about trying to run, seeking help from neighbors, but she worried that she might jeopardize their safety not to mention her young daughter back at Spahn Ranch. The next night she was selected again by Manson, who drove, with the three from the previous night, plus Steve Grogan and Leslie Van Houten, around the Los Angeles area for 3 hours, eventually winding up at the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca in the Los Feliz neighborhood. Charlie went into the home with Tex Watson, where they tied up the occupants, and when Charlie came out, he sent Pat and Leslie in. He then drove off with the others. Late that night in Venice Beach, Linda and Charlie walked together on the beach. She confided to him that she was pregnant, and he asked if she would kill someone. She said she couldn't, but Charlie left Linda, Grogan, and Sadie in Venice Beach with the instructions to find a man Linda knew and kill him. Linda thwarted those plans, and a few days later she left Spahn Ranch. However, she did not take her daughter with her. Tanya and the other children were kept from the others, and Linda could not get access to her daughter without arousing suspicion. She left and drove to find her husband, and failing to locate him in Los Angeles, continued on to the Taos, New Mexico area, where Bob was now staying. She learned the next week that the family had been arrested and later released, but all the children were in protective custody. She heard that Tanya was in a foster home, and she arrived back in Los Angeles on September 4th to retrieve her daughter. She was alarmed to hear that another woman had shown up to pick up Tanya days before, but thankfully was turned away for not providing valid identification. Linda took Tanya to Florida and her father's before continuing on back to her home state of New Hampshire. In late November, warrants were issued for all of the participants of the Cielo Drive murders, along with Charles Manson and Leslie Van Houten. On December 2nd, Linda turned herself in at the Concord, New Hampshire police station and offered full cooperation. She was nearly 6 months pregnant. The following day, Linda waived extradition and was driven by police to Boston, then flown back to Los Angeles. There, she was booked into custody and placed in solitary confinement. That month, Susan Atkins was the star witness at a grand jury proceeding in Los Angeles, resulting in the indictments of Manson and the others, including Linda. Susan cut a deal with the prosecutor's office. They would not seek the death penalty against her in exchange for her testimony. But Susan was targeted by the family, who threatened the life of her young son, currently in the foster care system while she was in jail, and eventually, against the wishes of her court-appointed attorney, she agreed to meet with Charlie. Lead prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi knew that meant Susan would flip, and she did. She also fired her attorney and replaced him with one that Manson approved. Susan would no longer testify against Manson and the others at trial. Linda's attorney, Gary Fleischman, contacted the prosecutor's office on February 26th and cut a deal for his own client. Linda had seen them committing mayhem at the Tate house. She had driven the killers to the LaBianca residence, but she hadn't done anything. Still, she was technically guilty of first-degree murder. I told her that a deal was the only way out. She initially didn't want to do that. These were her soulmates, no matter what they'd done. But I told her, you're broke, you're pregnant, and you were there. You must become a prosecution witness. They needed Linda Kasabian, and she needed them. They gave her total immunity. The prosecution sat down for their first meeting with Linda on February 28th. Bugliosi was impressed with the little hippie girl, as he referred to her for the rest of his life. She was heavily pregnant that day and emotional, often weeping as she described what she witnessed on August 9th and 10th. From the first interview, I believed her story, the prosecutor wrote in Helter Skelter, and I felt that a jury would also. There were no pauses in her answers, no evasions, no attempts to make herself appear something she was not. She was brutally frank. When a witness takes the stand and tells the truth, even though it is injurious to his own image, you know he can't be impeached. I knew that if Linda testified truthfully about those 2 nights of murder, it would be immaterial whether she had been promiscuous, taken dope, stolen. The question was, could the defense attack her credibility regarding the events of those 2 nights? And I knew the answer from our very first interview. They wouldn't be able to do so. because she was so obviously telling the truth. The moment that Manson and the other defendants learned that Linda would testify against them, a systemic campaign to impugn the woman began. On March 7th, Linda delivered a baby boy named Angel. She was returned to jail days after the birth. Despite the rumors, it is unlikely that the baby was fathered by Bobby Beausoleil, and most likely by her husband, Bob Kasabian. Early in March, prosecutors drove Linda to Benedict Canyon. Between tears, she walked them through the events of August 9th. She later recounted her actions and those she witnessed from the others on the night of August 10th. On March 13th, her infant son was flown with Linda's mother to New Hampshire, while his mother remained in Los Angeles, waiting to tell her story. The trial against Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten began in July 1970. Charles Tex Watson was still in Texas, fighting extradition. He would be tried later and separately. On the third day of trial, Linda Kasabian was led into court. She would spend 18 long days on the stand. Linda knew on the night of the murders that she'd be the one who'd have to tell the world what happened, recalled Bugliosi. She was an ideal witness. She'd been present both nights, but she hadn't participated. She said Manson gave the orders to kill everyone at Tate. She described watching Tex Watson stab Wojtek Frykowski. She said Manson directed them to the LaBianca house. As she talked about what happened, you'd see these expressions of terrible pain on her face. She was cut out of different cloth than the other family members. Susan Atkins was bitter that she had not been protected by the prosecution, but she concurred. Linda did what she should have done. She had a lot of advantages that I did not. Her daughter was now in the hands of her family on the East Coast. She was being held incommunicado. No one was allowed to see her. Linda's attorney said, Manson picked the worst lawyer he could have gotten, Irving Kanarek. He was famous around town as an obstructionist. If I'd been cross-examining Linda Kasabian, I'd have shoved that immunity agreement up her nose. Then I'd have gotten her off the stand. But Kanarek kept her up there. He'd ask Linda, how many times have you taken LSD? She'd say, 50. He'd ask, do you remember the first time? She'd say, yes. He'd ask, do you remember the last time? She'd say, yes. Then he'd ask, do you remember the 37th time? Vince would yell, objection, and there'd be a dozen lawyers at the bench. Manson sought him out for that reason, to foul up the trial. But it didn't work. Linda's testimony stood up. There are many who feel Linda should have been convicted of being an accessory at the very least. She herself said, I felt guilty. I felt as though I carried the guilt that nobody else had guilt for. They say that none of us should be judged based upon what we did in just one moment, or even on the worst day of our lives, but how about 18 days? Linda Kasabian was present for the murder of 5 human beings, but a year later she spent nearly 3 weeks on the stand, bearing witness so that the killers could be convicted. She spoke truthfully. She spoke tearfully. She showed remorse while the accused killers laughed and sang in court. The fact that she stood up to 18 days of questioning by the defense attorneys, laid bare the unsavory truths of her life, and did not break, is testament to her honesty. She was technically guilty of not seeking help, but she clearly did not plan the murders and did not condone them. Linda knew that Bobby had been arrested for the killing of Hinman since she took Bobby's call from jail. She might even have participated in a discussion about copycat killings to free him. But there is zero evidence that Linda led that discussion or even knew Bobby was guilty. She didn't fight extradition like Tex or Pat Krenwinkel. She didn't try to shock the jurors as Susan had during the grand jury. She never sold her story or tried to capitalize on her notoriety. Although a garnishment order by Wojtek Frykowski's son might have been a factor, Linda was later held civilly liable along with the killers. She went before the jury and the defendants months after delivering a baby, believing that the truth would allow her to live in this world and raise her children without hopelessness. Linda was truly seeking a transcendent experience as a young woman. There was little she was unwilling to try until it came to murder. Fun and games, LSD, orgies, and creepy crawlies were okay, a part of her extended adolescence. The night she witnessed 5 people murdered, her youth ended. As to the other rumors about her during the summer of 1969, not one shred of evidence has ever been presented. Fact after fact instead has been offered demonstrating that while Tex Watson drove to Cielo Drive, it was Charles Manson who selected that location and gave the orders to Watson to kill everyone there, and the women to follow Watson's lead. Linda Kasabian wasn't a hero, just a human being who did what she could after the fact. It wasn't enough. After the trials, Linda attempted to reconcile with her estranged husband, but the effort was unsuccessful, and she returned with her children to the East Coast. Linda married again and divorced again, giving birth to one more child before relocating to the Pacific Northwest. She gave few interviews over the years until the 40-year anniversary of the murders, when she appeared on 2 news programs about the deadly summer of 1969. Neither Linda nor her children got off scot-free despite her immunity deal. Plagued with drug and alcohol problems, she and at least one of her children were arrested several times over the years. As Linda herself said, she probably should have gotten therapy to deal with the trauma of witnessing the murder of 5 people and the burden she carried for not having acted to save them. I've learned to put it in its proper perspective over the years and deal with my own feelings of shame and guilt. Linda Kasabian died in 2023 of natural causes. California's allure in the 1960s was undeniable. It was a place where dreams of a better life seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Yet for many, that dream collided with harsh realities. The communal ideals of love and freedom were often undermined by exploitation and manipulation, and the countercultural movement that promised enlightenment became a breeding ground for darker impulses. The Manson family's story is a tragic testament to what happens when idealism is twisted by those seeking power and control. Spahn Ranch, with its dusty hills and crumbling movie sets, became the setting for one of America's darkest chapters, a place where the promise of California was irrevocably broken. For the young people who flocked to Manson, the dream of freedom ended in betrayal, violence, and disillusionment. Some, like Linda Kasabian, found the strength to walk away and help bring justice to those who could not escape. But the scars led by those experiences were deep and enduring. California remains even now a land of dreams. But the story of the Manson family serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked idealism and the predators who thrive on vulnerability. As we reflect on this period of history, we are reminded that the search for belonging and purpose is universal, but that it must be met with vigilance, wisdom, and care to avoid turning dreams into nightmares. Outlaws, drifters, and lost souls, many who found their way to the Manson family had already been living on the fringes of society. Some came with rap sheets, others with a taste for violence. In the next episode, The Wild Ones, we look at 2 men who entered the family from the world of crime and rebellion: Danny DiCarlo, a biker with the Straight Satans, and Bill Van Sickle, an ex-con with a shadowy past. Their time with Manson was brief, but their presence spoke to the dangerous undercurrent running through that era. Who were these men before they arrived on the scene, and what became of them after the family fell apart? Stay tuned.